I do think niceness is this kind of nation building myth that a lot of Canadians take for granted. I don't believe that Canadians are necessarily nicer than, say, Americans. I do think they're a lot more polite.
For a lot of proud Canadians, that might come as news to us. But this week, we'll be speaking to Jing, a freelance journalist published in the New York Times and Financial Times. Born and raised in China, he worked as a journalist for 7 years before moving to Toronto to pursue graduate studies. He is now working on a book about Canadian niceness and its social implications. Due to privacy considerations and potential retribution, we had to obscure Jing's identity. Our chat is a great side dish for commemorating Chinese New Year with a discussion about all things China related. Throughout, you'll hear us discuss Asian identity in the wake of COVID, discrimination faced, China's foreign policy with the Biden administration, and how optimistic Jing is about the two countries managing their differences. Please be advised that this chat does encounter some audio difficulties. If you enjoy the content and message we're putting out, please consider donating to us either through PayPal for single-time donations or Patreon for monthly contributions. They can be found on our homepage under the donation tab. They really do make a difference, helping support our writers and keeping this whole show running. Thank you again and enjoy the chat. Going back to the larger point of China and everything, from the perspective of today, where we're almost a year to sort of the lockdowns in Canada and also Chinese New Year coming up this week, sort of it seems like a very auspicious time, a lot of interesting dynamics going on and at play. I don't know how much you can speak about different things, but I guess from your perspective, seeing the new administration in the United States with the Biden administration, how is that being received and interpreted in China in terms of foreign policy, in terms of maybe trade policy and stuff?
Well, I don't know how it is being perceived by the top Chinese leadership, but my point of view is that I don't think with Biden in the White House, even with Biden in the White House, it's nearly impossible for us to sort of remove some of the fundamental, structural problems when it comes to U.S.-China relations. And what I mean by that is you're essentially looking at two very different countries with two very different systems, whether it be how both governments view power, how the judicial systems are kind of structured in both countries, and of course, a whole slew of other issues like freedom of speech. And I think a lot of the Biden advisors have already said that, we're not going to, essentially what they're saying is that we're not going to adopt a softer tone in dealing with China, even though we're not going to be like Trump, who, pretty much adopted I'm going to take on China myself, right? So what the Biden administration is going to do, and you've seen this in a lot of the media reports, is that they're going to rally, traditional American allies to sort of counter China's rise. But I think another interesting dynamic that doesn't, get a lot. With the rise of nationalism, everywhere, I guess, in China, you've got a really nationalistic leader, Xi Jinping, who basically says that, we want China to play a big role on the international stage. And under Xi Jinping, I really vividly remembered the sea change really under him, in a sense that, his predecessors basically, adopted a foreign policy characterized by, there's a phrase, let me try to get this right, bide your time, hide your strength, bide your time, right? So we're going to lay low. Whereas with Xi Jinping, he doesn't shy away from really asserting China's, power on an international stage. And by the way, that is, I believe, is cheered by a lot of Chinese people, because, after the 2008, Olympic Games in China, which was really the coming out party for a lot of Chinese people. A lot of Chinese people do believe that, we deserve a bigger voice, internationally. And then the US, of course, with the Trump administration, he is the tariff president. who talks a lot about America first, right? And I think there's two dimensions. One is economic, in a sense that, oh, China, has stolen a lot of jobs, with a lot of manufacturing jobs moving to Asia. So we're gonna, revitalize our economy by cracking down on China. And another dimension is more ideological, and you've seen, you can see this from the remarks by the Trump advisors, especially what's his name, the former Secretary of State Pompeo, who had pretty nasty things to say about China. So anyway, I don't see a drastic U-turn in China-U.S. relations, and it's funny. Like I think Biden did an interview with CBS this month. Basically, he said, in his own words, we need not to have a conflict with China, but there's going to be extreme competition between the two powers. So I think the competitive elements, are always going to be there. But I think, I don't know, what the Biden administration is trying to do is try to minimize the friction, while finding a way to sort of coexist with China, going forward. I do believe the next 10 years is going to be very interesting to see how China is going to reshape, the global order, even that's very cliched statement already.
Because that was what Xi had raised at one point, was talking about an alternative to sort of Western democratic society. And I think that is what scared a lot of foreign policy experts, pundits, journalists, was that they had sort of had this tunnel vision that the only thing really, since going back to Francis Fukuyama, this idea of the end of history, that sort of every government would look alike and that every culture would sort of aspire to this Western democratic system. And then you have this country which is rising, which is doing a very good job in terms of relatively wealth compared to their neighbors, in terms of technological sophistication, IP, research and stuff like that. And they're saying, wait 1 second, we're actually going to be following a different path entirely. And this could actually be a competitive path or even a superior path to what you have been advocating for this whole time.
That's really a great point. But I think one thing that, a lot of people have been talking about when they discuss China-U.S. relations or China-West relations in general is that, maybe let's, go back in time a little bit. I think the U.S. and China were really in a honeymoon period during the Obama administration. And Clinton actually lobbied, don't forget, Clinton actually lobbied really, really hard for China to get into WTO, right? Yeah. And his thinking and his argument at the time was that, and it's a very conventional thinking that just doesn't work well with China. His thinking at the time was that as a country gets richer, democracy will come.
Right, liberalizing.
And there will be liberalization. It is what has happened with other Asian countries like South Korea and Taiwan, but China is a anomaly in that sense. So I think you do have a point in saying that probably we're not going to see a convergence of one governance model. And I think I do want to bring up COVID a little bit. And I think the reason why COVID is relevant is because when COVID cases were going up like crazy in China last January, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, this is going to be a moment of reckoning in China." A lot of people were really, really angry at how China kind of muzzled critiques and those people who tried to warn the Chinese government, "Oh, you really need to take this seriously." And with the death of the doctor Li Wenliang, there was so much anger in China. But it's stunning, really. It is really stunning to see how China was able to kind of turn that narrative around. I can't tell you how many times my parents have sent me messages saying that, oh, look at China, what China has done, in kind of controlling this disease, which to their credit, they did do a good job. But the question we have to ask is at what cost, right? And I think the fact is that China has fared a lot better than a lot of countries elsewhere. And the sad reality is that China is using that as sort of political fodder to sort of bolster its claims that, look at us, there's a reason why you should believe in a Chinese system. Right. But that's definitely not going to be, I don't think that's something that a lot of people in democracies will accept. So I do think, the bigger picture is that we're going to see a lot more, tension between China and the West.
What was it like? I guess for me, I always bring it back to the Jewish example, but people probably often paint the Jewish community as one big brush, even though there's a lot of different factions and sectarianism going on. During this whole COVID outbreak, what was, maybe it's a generalization, but what are some of the discussions, or is there a lot of frustration among Chinese diaspora, let's say in Canada versus Australia? Is it a singular voice and singular opinion, or is there a lot of different contrasting opinions and conflict within the community going on about who's at fault, what type of public positioning should the community leaders take, and those kinds of things?
That's a great question. I really like that question. And the reason why I say that is because oftentimes when you look at Western media's coverage of China, let me put it this way. If you're a person born in Canada who has never been to China, and if you do what you do every day is to read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, you'll probably think that, I would never want to visit China one day. It's such a dangerous country with lots of pollution, lots of corruption. Now, even though a lot of that is true, I do think that China, it's sometimes is really dangerous to paint China in a kind of black and white way. And even when it's to the Chinese people, oftentimes people tend to think it's the Chinese people is a monolithic group, which cannot be far from the truth. To give an example, I don't know if you've heard of the very kind of buzzy app called Clubhouse.
Yes.
It recently got banned in China. I'm not surprised about that at all. So I guess what the point that I want to make is that, there are probably as many brainwashed people in China as there are, people who can think on their feet. And what's the name again? Clubhouse is an example. Clubhouse is an example of that, because you've seen a lot of people kind of discuss, political reforms in China. A lot of the, they've been discussing a lot of the topics that are deemed really, really sensitive in China, right? So I think, and even me, I like in a lot of ways, I'm very Chinese, but in other ways, I'm actually not very Chinese, right? The fact that I'm having this conversation to you probably would surprise a lot of people. And another anecdote that I want to share is, again, sometimes, I don't know how to put it. Like last April, I wrote an op-ed in the Toronto Star about how basically my argument was that, yes, the Chinese government did a really lousy job, but the Western governments didn't do any better, right? Okay. And then, I read through some of the online comments, and a lot of people were really upset about me, because the fact that, a lot of people were saying that, oh, you're from China, this must be a piece of propaganda. And even one person said that, why don't you go back to China, to read the article? So I think, I don't know, I do think that's a problem, that people tend to think of an ethnic group as, just one whole unity, sorry, one whole entity, without any like diversity. And I don't know what we can do to kind of change that.
I think it's interesting because, again, not to belabor the Jewish parallel, but I think it's very interesting because Asian Canadians, Asian Americans have faced a lot of historic discrimination. And it's not something which people probably are as familiar with. It's not one of the eye-catching, I guess, social justice issues. And I think in part maybe because Asian communities have done so well economically, educationally. But again, when you have resurgences of these types of incidents, I'm sure SARS was probably very similar. I don't know the hate crime statistics, but I'm guessing as well there probably was a similar analog going on over there. You see that just below the surface sometimes there are some very unappetizing opinions and dispositions towards Asian communities that may not be voiced all the time. And
I'm curious, what would you say to people who hold that opinion that, oh, Jewish people are all the same? Would you be willing to engage them at all?
it's a tough question. Like, you want to engage, you want to try to bring more knowledge into a conversation, but I guess it depends on what end of the spectrum. Like, are they open-minded? Are they willing to see something? Because for instance, like in the Jewish community, usually it's sort of split along religious observance, like Orthodox, conservative, Reform, from like the most literalistic to sort of the most flexible and maybe progressive, I guess, if you want to use that word. And so within those, you have a lot of massive differences. Like in the US, the Jewish community, quote unquote, is liberal leaning, but that's because 80% are probably Reform conservative. The Orthodox community, which is the most literalistic, the Black Hatters, and the most socially conservative, are huge Trump supporters. Like probably 9 out of 10 people support Trump. And that's also the fastest segment of the Jewish population that's growing in the US and especially in Canada. So it's a very complex picture. Again, like I think the same thing applies going back to China as well, is that we try to make generalizations and try to make something comprehensible to the general public, which requires a lot of expertise and a lot of, like, you cannot fit how to understand China or Chinese politics or diaspora into a bite-sized sentence on network television. If you want to understand the complexities and the tensions going on and the competing incentives, it's funny, you probably know this among all people because you're in journalism and trying to balance compelling versus sort of the substance and flair of writing. Like, how do you don't want to just sort of a point by point bombardment of statistics and stuff, but you also want to make it compelling and you want to make it truthful. It's hard to balance that, right?
Yep, it is hard, and it is something that I myself, have been working on.
Mm-hmm. How do you find seeing now I'm not sure if it's the right word, but sort of cultural exports from China, like TikTok, I think is an amazing, crazy phenomenon in a way. Like, to think that within every single pocket of probably most teenagers and preteens, they have an app that was developed in China with Chinese IP and Chinese inspiration that is like shaping how Canadians and Americans socialize, how they interact with one another, how they rank their popularity and social. I think that 20, 30 years ago, I don't think like anyone would have conceived of a Chinese application that would have forever altered the fabric of North America. Now today we're here.
Yeah. I'll have to say this up front. I don't have a lot of thoughts on it, primarily because I'm probably the least tech savvy person in the monk school, really. But I think traditionally what a lot of Chinese apps or Chinese technology companies have been very good at doing is to copy what other Western counterparts have been doing. Just give you an example, WeChat which is hugely popular in China, without which you cannot really function in the country. It's a little bit of everything, right? It's Facebook. You can post photos, you can post short stories. It's your wallet. It's PayPal. It is also Twitter. So it kind of converges all the functions from some of the biggest Western, social media platforms. I have to say that I've been a little bit surprised by the speed with which TikTok has become so popular in the West. I've never used it.
You're not missing anything.
It's good for them. And I think in terms of the security dimension of it, that's a legitimate concern on the part of the Western governments. And when it comes to that, I don't know what else to say. Yeah.
When you look, obviously it's hard when you're talking about foreign policy and just politics in general, but when you look, let's say 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, are you optimistic that the West and China will be on a better footing and a better understanding, or what are the dynamics and what are the factors sort of shaping that relationship over the next couple of years?
I'm probably very pessimistic. Well, maybe like I'm always kind of a glass half empty kind of person, given my journalism background, because as a journalist you go out to find problems. And the reason why I am pessimistic is because I think we live in a day and age where it is getting more challenging for people to sort of find common ground. We sort of always tend to talk past each other, right? I'm really, really grateful that I spent 7 years in journalism, because now I'm stating the obvious. Journalism has really made me a more open-minded person, because in journalism, you always try to get different perspectives, right? Even when you're doing, writing a story that talks about corrupt officials, you always give them a chance to respond. And for me, I'd be more than willing to really sit down. I'm not a big fan of Trump. I despise a lot of his policies. But I'd be very willing to sit down to have a conversation with Trump supporter. I want to understand how they think, and I think that ability has been lost in today's very divisive environment. So I think for that reason, I'm not going to be very optimistic about the future.
And now is that something you see more so in North American culture? Because I definitely see what you're saying in terms of the tension around free speech and sort of the fear of sort of cancel culture, of sort of first judgments. Obviously, it's not the only thing. There's obviously important issues sometimes to weigh against those, but is that sort of more of a North American cultural development, or is there something similar as well happening in Chinese culture amongst youth or academics as well, where you see a similar type of silencing or a fear of speaking?
I think it's a universal thing that transcends cultures.
So it's not a glass half full situation then?
Nope.
Thank you again for listening to our shortened podcast this week. We want to thank Jing again for taking the time and courage to chat with us. We are sure he'll join us again in the future, so stay tuned for new appearances and hopefully a book sometime down the road. Again, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find yourselves listening. If you enjoy the content and message we're putting out, please consider donating to us either through PayPal for single-time donations or Patreon for monthly contributions. They can both be found on our homepage under the Donate tab. Thanks again, and stay tuned.